Two weapons, born a century apart, both at the peak of what wood and iron and human ingenuity could produce. On the same afternoon, on the same field, they faced each other for the first and last time. The answer to which one won is not the answer you expect. The English longbow, made from a single stave of yew, the heartwood and sapwood grown together, one resisting compression, the other tension, as if the tree spent its whole life waiting to become a weapon. Draw it back to the ear, 150 pounds of force stored in a curve of living wood. Release, and somewhere, between 50 and 250 meters away, a man is already dead before the sound arrives. The Genoese crossbow, a steel prod mounted across a wooden tiller, spanned by a windlass that two men could crank in turns. 600 pounds of draw weight in some versions, more force than any human arm could generate unaided. The bolt it fires is short and heavy, a quarrel of iron-tipped ash no longer than a man's forearm. It does not need to be aimed with art. It needs to be aimed with patience. Two answers to one question. What does a medieval army do when the enemy has armor? The longbow is older than England. It comes out of Wales from a tradition of hunting and raiding in forested hills, where a short, quiet draw was worth more than plate armor. By the 13th century, the English crown had recognized what the Welsh had always known. A massed line of longbowmen was not a support weapon, it was the battle. Edward the Fern conscripted it. Edward III refined it. And at Crécy in 1346, Edward III's son, the Black Prince, proved what it could do to the finest cavalry in Christendom. Here is what the films do not show. The longbow archer was not a peasant pressed into service with a borrowed weapon. He was a specialist who had been deforming his own body since childhood. The skeletons recovered from the Mary Rose, the English warship that sank in 1545, tell the story without a word of text. Asymmetric bone development. The left arm's radius enlarged beyond the right. Spinal curvature, where the draw had compressed the same vertebrae thousands of times per year for decades. These men were changed by their weapon. The bow and the man grew together. English law made this compulsory. Statutes required able-bodied men to practice at the butts on Sundays and feast days. The longbow was not merely a military asset. It was a national program, an empire grown slowly in the bodies of its subjects. On the battlefield, longbowmen stood in massed lines, often flanking the men-at-arms rather than standing in front of them. They did not aim at individual targets. They aimed at the air above the enemy formation, releasing at an angle so the arrows fell like rain from above, punching through the thinner armor of horse and rider from above rather than straight on. A trained archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. In a company of 1,000 archers, that was 12,000 arrows in 60 seconds. The sky went dark. Men called it the storm. Begin with the wood, English yew. The ideal stave cuts through the boundary between heartwood and sapwood in a single piece. The dense, dark heartwood on the belly of the bow resists compression as it is drawn. The lighter sapwood on the back resists tension as it returns. Nature had engineered a composite material that human hands simply shaped. A finished warbow stave was roughly 180 to 200 centimeters long. As tall as the man who drew it, sometimes taller. The string was linen or hemp, waxed against moisture. If the string got wet, the bow still worked. That detail will matter. Draw weight varied. Estimates from surviving Mary Rose bows range from 100 pounds to 160 pounds of force, the equivalent of lifting a large man with one arm, held at full draw for a second, then releasing with precision. At close range, the Bodkin arrowhead, a narrow square-section iron point designed to concentrate force into the smallest possible area, could penetrate the ringmail of the 13th century at 100 meters and punch through the rivets of plate armor at close range. It was not guaranteed against full plate by the late 14th century, but it did not need to be. It killed the horse. Rate of fire is where the arithmetic becomes brutal. A trained English archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, not once, sustained for several minutes before fatigue set in. In the first minute of an engagement, before cavalry could close 200 meters, a longbow company could put more than 10,000 arrows into the air. At Crécy, Chroniclers describe the sky as so thick with shafts that the Genoese could not see the sun. That is not poetry, that is geometry. Yew stave, linen string, 3 dozen bodkin-tipped arrows, a bracer on the left forearm where the string would otherwise strip the skin to bone, a tab or glove for the 3 drawing fingers. Nothing else. The most dangerous ranged weapon in 14th century Europe weighed less than 2 kilograms and cost less than a good pair of boots. The crossbow is older still. Chinese armies used versions of it 1,000 years before the Genoese ever picked one up. In Europe, it arrived in its mature form by the 11th century, and the Catholic Church promptly tried to ban it. The Second Lateran Council in 1139 declared the crossbow hateful to God and unfit for use against Christians. The ruling was ignored by every army in Europe within a decade. A weapon that could punch through mail at 150 meters did not care about ecclesiastical opinion. The Genoese came to dominate the crossbow trade because Genoa was a maritime city that had long supplied professional fighting men across the Mediterranean. Genoese crossbowmen were not pressed farmers. They were contracted professionals who carried their own equipment, maintained it themselves, and hired out to the highest bidder: French, Spanish, Milanese, papal armies. By the 14th century, a company of Genoese crossbowmen on the battlefield was a mark of serious military investment. You hired them because they were the best at what they did, and what they did was not simply shoot. They fought as a system. The Genoese crossbowmen worked in pairs. While one aimed and fired, the other held a pavus, a tall rectangular shield, large enough to stand behind, heavy enough to stop a crossbow bolt. While the first man fired, the second spanned the next bow. Then they swapped. The pavus was not a luxury. It was what made the crossbow viable. 2 minutes of spanning time in an open field without cover against a longbow company was a death sentence. The pavus was the answer to that problem when it was available. The Genoese crossbow of the 14th century used a steel prod, not wood, not horn composite, but drawn steel, curved into a limb that stored more energy per centimeter than any organic material could manage. Spanning it required a windlass, a small hand-cranked ratchet device that allowed even an average man to load a bow, drawing 600 or more pounds. The mechanical advantage was the revolution. The crossbow did not ask you to be physically exceptional. It asked you to be patient and precise. Where the longbow archer earned his weapon over years of daily practice, the crossbowman earned his over weeks. Where the longbow chose its users, only those who could endure a lifetime of physical transformation, the crossbow accepted anyone patient enough to turn a crank. The quarrel it fired was short, 30 to 35 centimeters, iron-tipped, fletched with leather rather than feather. Short because it did not need to be long. It was not trying to arc through the air, it was trying to punch through steel at close range. At 50 to 150 meters, a heavy crossbow bolt could punch through mail, through gamison, and exit the other side. Against early plate armor, it was devastating. Against full plate of the kind that would emerge in the late 14th century, it struggled. But then, so did everything else short of a cannon. Maximum range on a heavy war crossbow was impressive. 300 to 400 meters under ideal conditions, greater than the longbow's practical ceiling. But effective range, the range at which you could reliably hit a moving target, was broadly similar, perhaps 150 to 200 meters for both. The crossbow's range advantage was meaningful for siege work, where the target was a wall rather than a moving man. In the open field, it bought less time than it looked. Training time is the figure that changes everything. A crossbowman could be brought to basic battlefield competence in days. A week of practice, learning to span the windlass, to brace the tiller, to aim through the simple notch, and a recruit was functional. The crossbow democratized precision-range combat in a way the longbow never could. A community under siege could train its own crossbowmen from scratch in the time it took to source the weapons. The longbow required years. Often, it required a childhood. 2 weapons, built from different philosophies of war. The longbow, 100 to 160 pounds draw, 10 to 12 arrows per minute, effective to 200 meters, lifelong training required. The crossbow, steel prod, 600 pounds or more stored mechanically. 2 bolts per minute, effective to 150 to 200 meters, days of training required. On rate of fire alone, the longbow releases 5 times as many projectiles in the same window. On penetration per shot, the crossbow delivers more force per bolt at close range. On logistics, the crossbow bolt is shorter, heavier, and harder to mass produce than the arrow, which could be made by any fletcher in any English village overnight. On training, the crossbow wins so completely it is not even a competition. The longbow was a national commitment. The crossbow was a procurement decision. One required a culture built around it, the other required only a purchase order and a ship manifest. And then there is Crécy, the 26th of August, 1346, the single afternoon when these 2 weapons met on the same field. The Genoese crossbowmen arrived at the battle having marched all day in summer heat. The English had chosen their ground, a slope that forced the attackers to advance uphill into the late afternoon sun. And then it rained. The English longbowmen unstrung their bows, tucked the strings inside their clothing, and waited. The Genoese left their pavises in the baggage train. When the order came to advance, their strings were wet. A wet crossbow string loses tension. Their bolts fell short. The English released their strings back to full draw and let the storm begin. Now 2 scenarios. In each, the weapon changes the outcome. First, open ground. 2 trained armies. A force of English longbowmen, 1,000 men, 36 arrows each, 10 releases per minute, facing an equal force of Genoese crossbowmen with full pavis support. The Genoese advance in pairs. Pavis is up, but the math does not favor them. At 200 meters, the English begin to loose. 10,000 arrows per minute, arcing down from above. The pavis covers the front. Nothing covers the top. At 150 meters, the Genoese have not yet returned fire. At 100 meters, their line has fractured under casualties. The pavis teams cannot coordinate, and the arrows are still falling. On the open battlefield with trained men, the longbow wins. Rate of fire is not one advantage among many. It is the only advantage that matters. Second scenario, a city under siege. The garrison has 3 days. The attackers are coming. The defenders have 200 untrained men, a supply of weapons, and no time. Give those men longbows and they are useless. The draw weight alone will defeat them before the enemy arrives. A bow that needs 150 pounds of sustained force, released with precision after years of practice, cannot be handed to a miller's apprentice on a Tuesday and expected to function by Friday. Give those same men crossbows and they are dangerous. Span the windlass. A miller can do this. Rest the tiller on the parapet. Align the notch. Release. In an afternoon, those 200 men are something an attacker must respect. The crossbow is the weapon that puts firepower in hands that have no right to it, and in a siege, that is everything. The crossbow wins. The verdict, then, is not which weapon is stronger. It is which war you are already in. The longbow is what a nation builds when it can afford to grow its own soldiers from birth. The crossbow is what a city hires when the walls go up and the time runs out. One is an institution, the other is a solution. And history, in the end, remembered the crossbow because gunpowder made the longbow obsolete and left the crossbow's logic behind in every siege engine that came after. Some weapons win battles. Some weapons change what a battle is. 2 weapons. 1 question. The longbow died when gunpowder arrived, not because it was outgunned, but because it required something no army could afford to mass produce: a lifetime. The crossbow did not die with gunpowder. Its logic, mechanical force replacing physical mastery, survived into the arquebus, the musket, the rifle. Every weapon that came after it owed the crossbow a debt. Next time on VS History, Spartan versus Samurai. 2 civilizations that made the same choice. Every man a warrior. Subscribe to find out which one paid the higher price.